Hi, friends, it's Meseidy, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud, my consistently inconsistent podcast on news, culture, and politics, where I share whatever I'm investigating and I'm interested in with you, and we kind of go through it together. However, today I have a special episode because I have a guest, and we've recently become acquainted over on Instagram, keep having discussions on the back channels. Her name is Rachel Reeves, and her Instagram is Here Are the Headlines.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I'm excited. So, we had been kind of conversing a little bit through DMs on Instagram. And so recently we had this Alabama embryo ruling, right? Alabama embryo sounds weird, but you know what I mean? We're talking about the Alabama Supreme Court case about frozen embryos. And so we're DMing on the back end, and we just decided that we should talk about it.
Right. And it's also kind of hilarious because on any given day, we are posting links and commentary, that kind of mirrors one another.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like, we should just have one account. Yeah. Yeah. So at some point I'm like,
we were joking that we're on the same time feed or social media feed or whatever, especially on.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know. Are you on X?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I source a lot of news there. It's also a good place, in my opinion, to kind of get a feeling for the most eccentric takes from both the progressive left and the super conservative right. You get the crazies on both ends of the spectrum. So then you can somewhat be prepared for the outlandish arguments that are going to come up on any given topic. And also I follow a lot of fellow Anglicans on there, which is great because we're new to that denomination the last couple of years. So I learned a lot on there. I really like X.
I think it's great.
Whatever. Yeah. Lots of people hate it, but I really get a lot of information there, and I appreciate the platform. So
yeah, for sure. So, well, to kind of get everybody up to date as to what happened. So was it last week that this ruling happened? Has it been a full week? I feel like it's been just over a week.
Yeah, it's been a little bit over a week.
So the Alabama Supreme Court ruled recently that frozen embryos, which happened through IVF specifically, are considered children or persons, not property. And so that has brought up a whole slew of debate, panic, frankly, in the media. I think a little bit of scare tactic, that sort of thing is also coming out of the media. An oversimplification of the opinion and really what it means. Of course, people are worried that this is something that could spread. I think that's something that we'll probably touch on a little bit. And so our goals with this episode is I'm going to provide a little bit of a background on the case so we know exactly why this case came around. We're going to hit some key points on the ruling, on the opinion, what opponents or the left is freaking out about. Specifically, there's a lot of people talking about they quoted the Bible. Well, it's not
right.
Really, I mean, they did, but it's not how they're trying to present it to be.
Right.
And then I guess maybe some of the most common questions that have come up since this ruling.
Yeah. And I think when we're talking about, when you mentioned scare tactics and really what the left is freaking out about, we'll talk about the couple major key narratives that I think that they're going to draw out from this and really parlay into a huge kind of overarching issue married to abortion.
Yeah.
That they're going to really hammer home for, the next 9 months or whatever. It's going to be this ruling for progressives, in my opinion, could not have come at a better time, even though they're acting like this is the
end of the world.
Obvious the next chapter in the Handmaid's Tale, Handmaid's Tale, excuse me. I don't even read it. But they are acting as if this was, ordained, pre-planned. It's just the next domino to fall in the larger takeover from the conservative overlords.
We could talk about
nationalists. Right. Right. The patriarchy, even though, I'm a woman.
Yeah.
But I'm ruled by
Well,
men,
it'll definitely
obviously.
be interesting, especially with the election coming up. And then I know there was during the midterms, abortion was like merited for being
Right.
the reason that the Republicans didn't do as well as they did. And so there's a
Right.
belief that they could parlay that in this general election
Oh, yeah.
and get Weekend at Bernie's back in the White House.
Yeah. Exactly. Oh, gosh.
So, okay. So, but let's give a little bit of background on the case. So, what happened here and the reason that this case came up. So, there were 3 couples that underwent IVF at a fertility clinic in Alabama. And the clinic artificially gestated and created embryos that were a few days old. And that's specific and quoted within the opinion that they were a few days old and that they were placed in cryo. So, they were frozen and they were put into a cryo nursery.
Can we stop real quick?
Yeah.
And just say that the term cryo nursery is so
it's very
like Orwellian
yes.
and creepy. It's creepy. It's not a nurse and people are going to say, oh, well, why would that creep you out if you think that they're, humans and if they have personhood, they're people. But the point is like, why would they call it a cryo
well, that's
nursery?
What I was going to say. It's really interesting when I've watched some of other people talk about this, share the story. Like I'm thinking about, I shared with you the Under the Desk News TikTok.
Right.
And then also Sharon Says So did a whole thing on it, which I meant to send you and I forgot to. And it's really funny how they're trying to present it as not being alive or a life or a child or a person or whatever, yet they can't help but use that language. And it's similar to here where we're calling it a frozen nursery is what it is. You know what I mean? It's a nursery of frozen children.
Right. They almost want you to feel bad enough for the people who this happened to in order to preserve the right to IVF, but not feel bad enough or acknowledge really just the very obvious truth of what those embryos are. They don't want you to feel that bad. Right. Just feel bad enough to keep IVF legal, but don't feel bad enough to actually think critically and deeply about what this is because it's a cryo nursery. Like, I don't know. Anyways, if I could unhear that, it would be great.
Well, the cryo nursery was located.
Yeah.
And I'm using the language that is in the opinion. So a lot of this is that what I'm doing is that I'm using what's the opinion. This isn't necessarily my opinion. So the nursery was located at the local hospital. And then the couples, of course, expected that the clinic is going to keep their frozen children safe and secure and monitored at all times. But because it's at the hospital, a patient, which I don't even know how this freaking happens, but a patient is just like wandering around and walks into the cryo nursery facility or wherever they're keeping these embryos.
Cryo daycare.
Yeah.
Gosh. It's just like dystopian.
Yeah. And starts like checking them out. And so in the process of checking them out, picks some up. I don't know what vessel they're in or what form this is in, but picks it up. And because they're in cryo, which is a high freeze, when you're at a high freeze like that, it can burn your hands. So the person drops him on the floor, kills the embryos, right? And then as far as I understand, they left the facility, didn't inform anyone. And it wasn't until later that it was discovered that they were dropped on the floor.
Can we pause and just ask state the obvious that I've been so consumed with learning about the case that I haven't done any further research on, is this person been arrested? What have the consequences been? Have they been apprehended?
Well, as far as I can tell, they're not even mentioned in the suit or the opinion. So the entire thing, they're going after the clinic.
Right. No, I just want to know, did they find out who this person was? I need to find out.
Yeah. I'm sure they did. But I have no idea. I didn't look into that to see were they held liable anyway or anything like that. Who knows?
Interesting.
I feel like that might, I don't know, maybe call me bias or I don't know, but it just seems like you have to have some mental situation or something like that to just go wandering into a place and start pulling out like
Right.
embryos.
Yeah.
Like it just doesn't
That
seem,
makes sense.
it doesn't seem like something that a logical
A normal
individual would do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but
Okay. Anyways, moving on.
that's what brought on the suit, right? And so the three families filed suit under Alabama's Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. And then they also said, well, if the death of our embryos do not qualify under that act, which requires it specifically to be a person or a child, then we have like this backup essentially. So if you determine that they're not a person or child and instead that they are property, they also had a suit that was a common law claims of negligence and wantonness. However, this is the part that I find really fascinating. So the trial court says that the embryos do not meet the definition of a person or child that would allow them to seek damages under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act because they don't meet the definition of person or child. However, they also couldn't bring a claim under wantonness or negligence because the damages for that are compensatory, not punitive. Yeah. So like in a Wrongful Death Act, it's punitive. In the negligence and wantonness, it's compensatory.
So basically money or like it's a civil case or it's not like it's basically
so then the thing is like, so it's like, medical expenses, damages, that sort of thing. But the state of Alabama does not allow compensatory damages to be granted for human life. And because the embryos were considered a human life, they also were not able to seek damages against the clinic. So there's like this whole like debate essentially happening in the trial court, even before it gets up to the, Alabama Supreme Court, where they're saying it's not a person or child, but it is a human life. And because it's a human life, you can't get damages this way. But because it's not a person or a child, you can't get damages through the Wrongful Death Act, which I think is kind of nuts.
Wow.
If you really think about it.
It is. Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of circular logic. And, eventually, I think, essentially they're arguing personhood there.
Yeah. So they basically ruled that the embryos did not meet the definition of a person or child, but they acknowledged
that
they were human life, which, so it's alive.
Alive.
It's a,
what is it?
Yeah. Again. Oh, just
like, like
just even like saying,
because that's what they'll say. Yeah. Well, it's an embryo. Well, but what is an embryo?
What is that then? Yeah. I think that's the hardest thing when you have to say these things out.
What is a woman? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, if you have to say it out loud, it really shows you how just utterly confused it is. And I think when you say when you really look at how our complex judicial system and the minds of man cannot even make sense of this, we can't. This court can't even define what an embryo is, and because they can't, they have to say, well, it doesn't really meet the definition of a person, but it's also a human life. It just shows how very complex this is, but also how very simple it is. And maybe we just shouldn't mess with.
Well, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be messing around with this at all. And I don't even think it's that.
We don't even know what it is.
I don't think it's complex as much as like we're just making the issue complex because of because of scientific advancements that were not challenging the ethical issues or the moral, moral or ethical issues with those scientific.
Right. We're making it complex.
Exactly.
We're making it complex. Right.
Yeah. So that's what the lower court did. Right. So of course, the parents are probably thinking like us, like, well, wait a minute. You're saying it's not a person or a child, but you're saying it's a human life and we can't seek damages here. So they file an appeal. And what I found really interesting, one of the things that the opinion clarified was that all the parties agreed that embryos were life, that the life begins at fertilization and ends at death, and that an unborn child usually qualifies as a human life, human being, or person. And it's true throughout all stages of viability. So it doesn't matter if it's like 10 weeks old or 24 weeks old or like 3 days old. It's always a person, human being, or human life.
It's a life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So they all agree on that, right? But then the defendants go and they argue, this is according to the opinion, that the unborn child ceases to be a child or person if it's not in the womb, which again is about place.
Then what is it? Like, okay, yeah.
You know what
Location.
I mean? Yeah. So
yeah, because then we're going to get into the conversation of like, oh, okay, well, if it's going to be determined by location, then are we going to talk about stage? Then like everything has a level to which people all of a sudden become really comfortable with messing with life. And it's always determinative of certain like qualifiers, oh, well, it's only a life if it's inside the mother, but then it's also not a life technically because it's not fully developed.
Or it's not cognizant because a lot of times the left is like, they're not conscious. So it's not really a life.
Yeah, it has no soul.
Which is why they've progressed to the point of like unfettered abortion.
Right. Because until it passes through the vaginal canal or is
like,
getting cut out of you, then now I'm a human. Okay. Anyways, okay. So
the appellate court was answering the question of whether or not this act, the wrongful death of a minor act, whether the embryos qualified as a person or child. And what the defendants were trying to argue was that there is an unwritten exemption within this act that basically says that if it's not in utero, it's not a person or child. Because remember, they're acknowledging that every embryo is a life regardless of stage.
Right.
Yeah.
So they'd have to have an exception. They would have to make their argument make sense. Yeah.
So that's what they're trying to say. There's like, well, there's an unwritten rule that if it's not in utero, then it's not a life.
That's convenient. I love that. We could just make up unwritten rules now. That is very handy.
And we'll go through this because like some of the arguments are, because I believe this act was written in like, I think it passed in like 1870s.
1870. Yeah. Yeah, 1872, I think.
There's a lot of argument about, and we'll probably get into this if you're an originalist and stuff like that. Like, what did they mean at the time that they wrote it? And some subsequent case law can kind of give us a view of like what was meant. But, I don't know if we get to the point of like, I don't like the idea of unwritten rules because like you can't argue an exemption and then, you know what I mean? Like, it just seems like if you were to do that, you could literally make anything up. It's an unwritten rule.
Right, exactly.
So, but the court ruled 8-1 that the act applied to all unborn children, regardless of their location. It didn't matter in utero, out of utero, is a person, right? So that's kind of like where we're at. And that's when everybody started freaking out.
Right. Everybody lost their minds. And it's not just progressives either. Republicans, conservatives, started losing their minds too, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, well, and I can, I kind of see why, because a lot of people are just reacting and being, frankly, emotional and fearful of, their desire to have a child and then their desire of having a child being taken away from them. But then again, we're not really fully exploring what it means to undergo IVF. Like, what does that actually mean? So let's first touch how they reached this ruling. Because there was the primary opinion, and then there were other judges that they concurred, but they added some extra commentary, and then we had the one dissent. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing they really seem to hold on to, which I think is, in its simplest form is the most valid, is that in 2022, Alabama passed a right to life constitutional amendment, which banned abortion.
Really
And acknowledge the sanctity of life. And I say the sanctity of life because that's also going to come up in our discussion.
Also what some people are really freaking out about. Yeah. But I think that the Alabama passing the right to life constitutional amendment is really what progressives are latching onto as kind of a outline, saying, look, they're doing this in tandem while also using kind of fear propaganda, saying, all Republicans or all conservatives, they want these total bans. And look at what they've done. Look at Alabama. That's they're going to use that as a model for what they want to do nationwide. Look at Alabama pass this right to life constitutional amendment. Now look, they're taking away IVF. Then what's next? Contraception. And then what's next? Women can't work and have to stay at home and have a dozen babies each. They're going to kind of use this I think they're going to say that Alabama's a model. They already have. I've already heard it. So I think that the fact that Alabama had passed that, they're going to really lean into the state's constitutional amendments as a kind of a scare tactic,
Well, and what's interesting though, which the opinion brings up, and when I'm right now, I'm just talking about the primary opinion, which the whole thing, the whole document that's released is 131 pages. Mind you, 41 pages of that, almost like 40% of that is the dissent. So
yes, they were ready. They were ready for that dissent. They were like, all right, here we go.
Like, to give you a little bit of context, 40% of that was the dissent. And the primary opinion, I think, was like 12 pages long or something like that. It wasn't that long per se. And then everything that came along with it was, okay, here we go. It was 25 pages long. Sorry, not 12, 25. But, and then everything else is the other justices agreeing and then also adding their additional commentary. And then a lot of the case, so the Wrongful Death Act passed in 1872, I think it was, or 73.
I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, you talk about that constitutional amendment and a lot of people kind of freaking out about it. However, there is previous case law that you can see the state of Alabama, first of all, which is generally, I don't think there's any argument that it's a conservative state, but you can see through the case law how the definition of what is a child progresses. So immediately after the Wrongful Death Act was passed, they were saying, no, it does not apply to children in the womb. Later, through cases like they reference Mack and Hamilton. They say that, yes, it is. And then also they progress to it doesn't matter because originally I think Mack said depending on state of viability, and then Hamilton expanded and affirmed that, and then said the state of viability doesn't matter. Now, this is all through case law. And then later they had some legislative, where it was the Brody Act and the Human Life Protection Act. Exactly. Where they continued to add protections for children in the womb. And then, which ultimately crescendoed, I don't know how else you want to put it, to a constitutional amendment. So to just kind of be like the state unilaterally on its own, or these raging Republicans were like,
this did not happen just because Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Exactly. The state for a long time tried to abide by Roe v. Wade, but then also do what they could do to protect the sanctity of life within their state. And then once Roe v. Wade got overturned with Dobbs, they passed the constitutional amendment. So it wasn't like a night and day kind of thing. We're talking about a long period of time.
Exactly. A long period of time. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that what you read when you were reading the opinion, was the crux of their argument in order to determine it was a human life? Or what did you read into it?
No, I basically read the same thing. It actually, we were talking before we started recording, that it's a pretty simple ruling and opinion to read. I've read other rulings, and it's a slog, but this was actually pretty basic. It was pretty simple.
Straightforward.
The arguments, and the dissents, they're not convoluted. They're pretty straightforward. So I think you summed it up really, really good. And I think this would be a great opinion and ruling for people to read, to get familiar with how these things work. But like we said earlier, there's not a whole lot of them that are written this simply. I think it's a great place to start, and it can really give you a more robust understanding of what this is all about. Because if you simply listen to sound bites, especially in mainstream media, you're going to get a very different narrative than if you just read it on its face. You see what I'm saying?
Well, and I think it's really interesting, and I think this one's worth reading because the concurring, it says it was an 8-1, but one of the justices he's like, I agree, but there's also a whole bunch of issues that maybe we need to address.
Yeah.
So in the primary opinion, they point out the concerns about, he directly addresses the concerns that the dissent has about this is going to ultimately eliminate IVF, which we'll touch on that. Right. But he heavily focuses on the constitutional amendment, and then Mack and Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
However, what's interesting is because I just going to put it out there. I'm on board with this opinion, like the ruling of it, the conclusion of it. It's like, I agree with you. I don't think it's rocket science. I don't think it's, I think it's kind of obvious that
that's not a huge leap to say if you're pro-life or if you care about the sanctity of life or you believe in the concept that there is sanctity to all life, start to finish. It's not a huge leap to, like you said, to kind of go, something about IVF feels off. And of course, there's going to be exceptions to IVF as a procedure where I can see people saying, well, we did it responsibly. We only did, we only had 2 embryos made. We implanted both, or we implanted both. We hope for the best. We're not eliminating embryos in utero. And we could talk about all that. Of course, there's going to be exceptions where we can look at that and go, yes, you did it responsibly.
Well, but the issue is right now in the States, it's kind of a Wild West. It's like, and we'll touch on that, where it's like as many as possible and, to up your chances. But the interesting thing is that one of the other opinions who agreed points out that there is conflicting legislation that's still on the books in Alabama. So now I'm not a legal, like I worked with attorneys and I'm pretty familiar with legalese and everything like that, but I'm not an attorney myself. And I'm especially not a constitutional attorney, right?
Right.
So I'm speaking from a very layman's position here.
Right.
And this is not legal advice and please don't listen to me. Like all of those disclaimers. I'm putting them out there, right? So one of the other justices pointed out, and I think it was Justice Parker. So he kind of brings up how there is conflicting legislation. So I think a lot of us can talk about, especially like if you're someone who's a constitutionalist, originalist, or anything like that, it's been really annoying to see the courts essentially legislate from the bench. Or like through, I understand the idea of precedent, but, I think it's a concept that's abused, frankly. In order to just like force legislation. So as I previously mentioned, the original act did not define a child in utero as a person. And then it wasn't until later years through case law that the definition of a person developed. And then eventually we got to the end and it was like, it is a person and it doesn't matter viability, because the big thing was like an issue of viability. Now, none of that case law was talking about whether it's in utero or out of utero. It was about age and viability. It wasn't until the Brody Act, which, because I think what happened is that there was an auto accident or something. I might be incorrect, but a child dies in the womb due to some kind of trauma. And then they brought the Brody Act. So somebody can be held criminally liable for the death of that child.
Which happens in many states, that's not, exclusive or unique to
even California, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not unique to Alabama. There's laws on the books in many states that if you kill a woman and she's pregnant, you're liable for the death of 2 humans.
2 lives, not just one.
This is this has been normal for a long time.
And then the Human Life Protection Act passed in 2019. And what's interesting there, which is what Justice Parker brings up, is that when this legislation passed, they specifically included the language in utero because he also references how they debated on the floor that they wanted to include the language in utero because they didn't want to cause any negative effects to IVF.
Yeah.
So both Brody and the Human Life Protection Act include language that says in utero. And then in 2022, they pass the constitutional amendment, which just says unborn. It doesn't say anything about location or anything like that. So what do you think?
Do you think that, before I tell you my opinion about just the ruling, but do you think then without the 2022 constitutional amendment to the Alabama Constitution that this ruling would have been the same?
Without the constitutional amendment, I don't think you could claim that like a frozen embryo was a human. Like, and I'm not saying this is not my opinion. This is literally like going by their legislation. I don't think it would have gone their way. Like, I don't think they would have found it to be a person or a child because of the Human Life Protection Act was like Alabama's attempt to do some form of a constitutional amendment or protection of the unborn without being able to because of Roe versus Wade. And it was before Dobbs was overturned and everything like that. So
yes,
I think that was their way. And the fact that they even debated the issue and said, this does not include IVF because we don't want to affect anybody going through IVF treatment. I don't think it would have made it, honestly. Yeah. Is that what you think?
Well, I agree with you. And which is what makes it really hard. I've been watching lots of conservatives talk about this ruling, just very happy with the outcome, which I share. I also am happy about this outcome because I think these definitions need to be made. I think that these arguments need to be had, and people need to be thinking about this. We can't just have this entire industry that is, like you said earlier, the Wild West, where people are, I mean, you got Paris Hilton saying like, I have 25 frozen babies. The fact that it's insane. But I also know that there's a lot of well-meaning people who will have 5 to 7 embryos saved because they extracted so many and then only wanted to implant so many. And then they decided that they didn't want any more children. So we need to be asking these questions because this can't continue. I mean, it can, and it has. I mean, look at surrogacy. It's still legal, which is...
that's a whole other can of worms.
We could do that another time. But so yes, this conversation needs to be had. And while I share your sentiment that I am very pleased with the outcome, when I was reading the dissent, I could definitely see, and even with the people who, they agreed with the ruling, but they wanted to share their thoughts, they too were concerned about the way that this is being, the way that this law is being enacted. It is being ruled from the bench when really on both a state and a federal level, these decisions need to be legislated in the legislature. Like that's why we have these lawmakers. That's the process that our government has set up. States have these rights. This stuff, in my opinion, when I was reading the dissent, I could definitely get on board with some of the arguments. And also, there was one quote in the dissent where it said, because this court is in the judicial branch, its role is limited. And applying the original public meaning of the words in a statute helps this court to stay within its constitutional role, which is a fundamental part of democracy. And I think it's important. Of course, I want certain rulings, but I also, to preserve this structure we have that really does work quite a bit of the time, if it's done correctly, right?
When it's done correctly and respected.
I want to see that preserved. And the way we preserve it is not how, I don't know, anybody who's looking at our federal, our Congress and how it continually for the past decade has just abdicated its responsibility and sent things to the Supreme Court because they are kicking the can down the road. They don't want to legislate. They want to preserve their
position. They want to, their office, right. And they're afraid that if they vote on it, it's going to affect their next election.
And that's dangerous. We don't want that. That's not how it's supposed to work. So I definitely can see the frustration from the judges or, even the one judge that was like, I appreciate this ruling. However, I have concerns.
Yeah.
I could definitely get on board with that. I definitely saw wisdom in her voicing, I believe it was a female, voicing that concern. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. But yeah, I think that this ruling is important and I agree with it. This has to be stated. It has to be understood and contemplated. We can't just continue as we have.
Well, and I guess this would be like a legal question if we had like an attorney on hand or whatever, because the constitutional amendment language is very simple. It says unborn child. It doesn't, regardless of viability. And I don't think it mentions location. Like, I think it's just viability and that it's an unborn child, that it's a person, it's a child.
Yeah, so that's pretty clear.
Yeah. So the sticking point here is like the location. You know what I mean? Which I think is really interesting because I think for the most part, when you say unborn child, it's in the womb. But a
Right.
frozen child is a embryo that hasn't yet been born.
Well, and that's the difference is we are pro-lifers. So we think that any child, regardless of location, is a human life. It's a child because we believe in that. But that's where progressives can say, yeah, this is malarkey. It's crazy that you would consider an embryo a child because they don't even believe the baby in the utero is a child half the time.
Yeah.
Like they can't even define what at what point viability even begins. They can't decide. One time it's 24 weeks, for someone else it's 17, for someone else it's 12 or 6 weeks because there's pain involved. Like they don't even really believe. I mean, I hear people, progressives all the time, just saying extremely casually, like, oh, no, the baby doesn't have a soul till it breathes its first breath. And
just nuts.
It is nuts, but it makes it very easy then to understand that for them, they would think that an embryo, that it's wild. I mean, to them, that's crazy because I mean, they can't even really state when they believe this thing, in their opinion, becomes an actual human worth saying, okay, yeah, maybe we should have a law that you can't abort your baby at 28 weeks. For some people, that's a stretch. So this is who we're arguing with here.
Well, and if my question, because you asked me, like, if it wasn't for that legislation, like if that legislation hadn't specified in utero, and the previous case law is just says regardless of, like the previous case law says regardless of viability and that it's an unborn child, right?
Yes.
It's not where the uterus, which just sounds ridiculous, but the uterus doesn't really come into question until this Human Life Protection Act, which is in 2019, because specifically because they're trying to protect IVF. If they didn't include that language, then it would be considered a human life in this opinion, right?
Yeah. In the constitutional amendment, it's very clear. They did not put that in the constitutional amendment. I think for a reason. And so it makes it easier, of course, then to pass this, because to the people who passed that, who were duly elected, like by the people of Alabama, so everybody's getting all mad at Alabama. Well, this is what they wanted. I mean, a lot of people voted for certain laws.
Well, the Constitution, that constitutional amendment happened through a vote. Like, through an election.
So don't get mad at Alabama, don't move there then if you are so opposed to it. But I think that it's because the constitutional amendment was made, it led to this ruling. And it makes it easier for me to go, yeah, I'm glad that this passed. And yes, I see why it could. That being said, I can also extrapolate from the dissent some concerns that people might have about the process and how it has been abused. And
so, okay, before we move on, I just one more question on this. If you agree that this is essentially being legislated from the bench, like, do you see that argument or do you not?
No, because the constitutional amendment made it clear that a person is a person, no matter how small.
Okay.
If I'm going to reference the Lorax, then no, they're not. It's clear to them. And this is the right ruling. That being said, in some of the dissent's language, I did kind of pick up, and not even just the dissent, like I said, the one justice that agreed with the decision but had some concerns. They are looking at it from a legal perspective that I do not have, and seeing where there can be issues that arise with people adding to texts from, say, 1872.
Well, they're adding and redefining words through case law and through rulings as opposed to going through the legislator, which is how it should be done.
And that's where I went, okay, I can definitely see that. I don't necessarily agree with you, but I can see how you can be concerned about that encroaching danger for our kind of branches of government, our system, the way we are to do things.
Well, and I think this points out there's a big difference between having a discussion about the moral, ethical issues of it versus how our how our government works. And even though it might be a slow, painful, annoying process,
yes,
it is essentially a built-in vetting process, and it's
right.
the most efficient one that we have, even though sometimes they get it wrong.
Yeah, and you want, like, it's hard to talk about it because most people want to just take a ruling and look at it and go, I agree with it or I don't, move on, instead of talking about the process, which is why so many progressives were so mad when Roe was overturned and they weren't willing to have a conversation. I mean, they're not willing to have a truthful conversation about abortion in general, but they definitely didn't want to have a conversation about what the problems were with Roe to begin with, which is why it ended up ultimately
getting overturned,
falling. It was a mess of a case. And I think that conservatives especially would do themselves a great favor if they were willing to sit down and kind of be able to separate the two, like you said, talk about the moral and ethical concerns and problems we see with something like IVF, but then also talk about the case and be very clear-eyed and honest about possible problems with the way a ruling came about. I think we need to be able to have both conversations.
Yeah, I think so too. And then like another question that has come up a few times is whether or not this is something that can be appealed to the Supreme Court. As far as like the way I would probably answer that most simply is that yes, but unlikely. So yeah, anything can be, you could submit to the writ to the Supreme Court and see if they'll hear it for appeal. But, the Supreme Court's very selective. And this current panel of justices has already said that this kind of a question, which I think, even though it's not specific to abortion, it is specific to discussing about whether or not it's a life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have kicked this back to the states. And Alabama passed a constitutional amendment on it. So
yeah, and I think that I think that they're showing, even with them refusing to take an affirmative action case that came up, I believe it was last week. In my state of Virginia, I think that they're showing they don't have an appetite to be relitigating all these things over and over again. They've handed out their ruling about affirmative action. We're not going to take another one this term, and same thing with, I think the big takeaway for Dobbs is that they're returning this power to the states, which again is good because that is how our country is supposed to work. There are states issues, and states need to take care of certain things through their process. And of course, some of those things get brought to the Supreme Court for adjudicating, but they answered that question and they said, this is a state issue. We need to take care of it there. And I just don't think that
we need at least like a few of the justices to cycle out before that would even be feasible. And so like one of the things that really came up a few times in the dissent that the original opinion addressed, besides the conflicts of legislation, was this concern of ultimate elimination of IVF for the state of Alabama. And we have seen 2 clinics, I believe so far, and I think pretty large clinics in the state of Alabama that have put a pause on IVF treatments. And just to put this out there, I think it is wise that these clinics, even though it is devastating to people who are currently seeking a cycle of IVF, and I can sympathize with that. I think it is wise for the clinics to put a pause because they have to seek legal counsel to figure out what's the best way forward. What can we do to be in compliance? And let me tell you that these clinics, even though they're out of the goodness of their sweet little hearts, they want to give you a baby.
They also want to get paid.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it brings up a lot of questions too, because yes, I think it's smart and wise for a company that has this much at stake to, like you said, seek counsel and find out like, okay, we need to now be reevaluating how we store these, what our security issues, our security concerns are now. I don't know how they wouldn't have been thinking about that already, but here we are. And so I want again, it goes back to kind of the mainstream media's push for like fear mongering, how they're saying that now IVF is inaccessible. It's going to become outlawed in Alabama and across the country. And that has not happened. Yes, these clinics are taking a pause, but in my opinion, they're using that as oh my gosh, look at this. This is so negative. This is horrible. But isn't that the whole point, they should be doing this to further protect these embryos, which the mainstream media is trying to have us be extremely sympathetic to people who need IVF. Wouldn't they want and desire this level of security so that something like this doesn't happen again? It's kind of this very convenient outrage. And if you really kind of drill it down, well, okay, you want us to sympathize with people who have these embryos and people who want to seek IVF treatment, but you're now mad that these IVF clinics are going, wait a second, how do we proceed? What do we do so we don't all get...
Well, and I can see what you're saying there, because this does obviously force or incentivize these clinics to up their security. And because they have more liability now because of this.
Right. Yeah.
However, there's also the concern about if I have these extra embryos and we destroy them, does that mean I can be held liable? And which that is a whole other can of worms, which is, I think, probably more of the prying issue and the concern of the clinics, besides the fact that having some random person walk in a hospital gown, touching things shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Well, and I think it's again highlights why this discussion should have happened so long ago, especially by conservatives, because now we're left in a position where, in my opinion, if IVF was no longer available in our country, I consider that a net good. But now we have to, since that didn't happen, and there's a proliferation of it in every single state, and there are millions and millions and millions of these basically frozen children in cryo nurseries. Now what? What happens now, though? In a state like Alabama that has acknowledged this, if these IVF clinics decide this is no longer profitable, we can't do this. We're really facing quite a bit of liability. What happens to all those embryos? Now we're left with the question of, okay, if parents now are afraid to engage in IVF, or they're unable to based on certain things, this ruling, perhaps similar legislation in other states, what happens to all those embryos? And these are questions that never get asked until we're so deep into it.
Until it's a problem. You can't do anything except continue the status quo.
It's a lose-lose, really, when you look at it in that situation. And all these questions should have been asked up front at the beginning of this burgeoning technology. Oh my gosh, should we mess with this? Just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. And look at where we're at now, a couple decades down the road. We have millions of what we believe as pro-lifers, what I believe as a Christian is a human life, a bunch of these frozen babies.
In stasis, there.
And just what do we do with that? How do we reckon with that?
And then, so one of the things that the opinion brings up, because the dissent specifically, just in one sentence, flat out is this is going to bring an end to IVF in Alabama. I was about to say Atlanta. Mm-hmm. I have no idea why. The opinion points out that this needs to be resolved through legislation, and that there's a lot of other Western companies, Western countries that have restrictions on IVF. For example, that you can only be willing to gestate as many as you're willing to implant. You know what I mean? To minimize having to discard or destroy embryos. And actually, I believe some of them, and we're talking about Australia, Italy, I believe the UK also, because, especially progressives, they love to compare themselves to other countries because they're so much better than we are.
And that's not great when it comes to the abortion IVF situation, because they're
much more restrictive.
They're so much more restrictive, and they like to point to them and we're winning because we're letting women abort their babies at 26 weeks because, whatever. But if we look at those countries, I believe what you were going to say, and it's funny because I put that same note down to bring it up. See, we're always thinking alike. It was basically lots of these countries have these ethical panels where it's comprised of medical doctors, ethicists, even sometimes religious priests or pastors that discuss each of these cases. And they also do it when it comes to abortion. When is it ethical? Is it legal? What's the specific situation? Where here, again, when it comes to abortion, IVF, surrogacy.
Well, and I mean, I hadn't heard about those panels, but I think a lot of people here in the United States, I think culturally that wouldn't jive. Do you know what I mean?
It wouldn't.
Like
Right.
nobody, like we painstakingly go through the process of legislation because
Oh, yeah.
I immediately think like, even though I think that kind of panel might be a good deal,
Right.
then what happens if that panel starts to switch? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would not work in America. Give me a break.
Yeah,
Like someone's going to let four doctors and ethicists tell them what to do. Yeah, we're going to try that here in
Yeah,
America.
I don't feel like that's going to fly here.
All that to say, it is handled so much differently in other countries. And why I bring it up is to highlight that we can disagree with that form of adjudication, but we can also observe that it is a more thoughtful process in a way that here, this whole autonomy argument has really been kind of disfigured to allow us to just do whatever we want and not have to question.
Well, and I think that's a really fascinating thing to point out, because even though as much as I think here in the United States, and we're kind of getting into a side topic here, you know, we're a culture of independence, you know, individuality.
Right.
For a long time, that independence and individuality was governed primarily through our faith and our religion.
No more. Yeah.
Yeah.
No more though.
As opposed to now, it's just like, I'm just going to do, you know, it's become so much more secular that it's like, I'm going to do whatever I want and whatever gratifies me. And I want a child. So it doesn't really matter. So like when I want a child, it doesn't matter whether it's a life or not. And when I don't want a child, it also doesn't matter if it's a life or not.
Right. Right. There is no foundational mooring. And like you said, we are really getting off on a tangent. I think we could do a whole
that's a whole other
episode on the loss of, religion in our country. But it does pertain to this because we don't have similar foundations or any foundations, religiously speaking, to tie to our ethical and our moral views and values.
That is a standard.
Yeah, we are going to find ourselves in these very precarious, dangerous situations when it comes to matters of life and death. And, as we're seeing with this, there are so many, their tentacles are everywhere. There's so many implications. And that's scary.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting that we actually kind of touched a little bit on religion and faith there, because one of the big things that the media and progressives were freaking out about, like when I sent you that Under the Desk News TikTok,
right?
One of the first things out of her mouth was like that the opinion cites the Bible.
Right.
And what they're doing is that they're trying to make the argument that the opinion is based on the Bible. And then everybody's going like separation of church and state, which is a whole other conversation that I'm not going to get into right now. But
but we could.
But their big thing is like they cited the Bible. That's the reason that Alabama ruled this. This is like something to get upset about. It's a violation. And it's like a step away from the Christian nationalist rhetoric that we're starting to listen to, which frankly, I think is a psyop, but that's a whole other thing.
Yep.
So
correct.
To clarify exactly how that worked its way into the opinion, it is not the basis of the ruling at all.
I mean, people would know this if they read it.
If they
all those people talking about this case, they would know it if they read the ruling.
Exactly. So like the first 24 pages, which is the primary opinion, does not mention the Bible at all. There's not a single word of it. What happened was that there was a concurring justice that is adding language or adding an explanation as to why he agrees and how he also came to this conclusion. And it's kind of probably the drier of all the opinions or the concurring opinions and stuff like that. I think it's one of the drier ones because he tediously goes through, not only does he touch on some passages of the Bible, and I'm going to tell you why he does that, but he also tediously goes through dictionary definitions.
Right. I mean, I appreciate it. He's very thorough.
Yeah.
Very thorough.
So this whole thing about different dictionaries through different time and what it means to be a person and what a child means, like he's going through it. Okay. Then eventually he also reaches where he starts talking about the Bible, but he specifically points out that the reason that he is touching on this is that he is looking to define what sanctity of life means. And he points out that, it's real specific, and it is in the amendment to the Alabama Constitution. It says sanctity of life. And he also points out in the opinion on page 30, where he says that Alabama did not choose the term inviolability, which is typically what more progressive, non-religious people would use, or secular. Rather, they chose sanctity. So then he goes, that is what leads him to go through this whole discussion of sanctity, which is frankly a religious term, or it's a reference and acknowledgement of like God and that life is sacred.
Yeah. And he didn't just throw in there the Bible verse. He also, prior to putting in the Bible verse from Jeremiah, he also wanted to point out that that kind of language is not foreign to the Alabama Constitution.
Exactly.
And that it's been in there before. He references a portion of the preamble that, quote, invokes the favor and guidance of Almighty God from the Alabama Constitution, and that all men are endowed with life by their creator. So he's basically saying that the Alabama Constitution, this is not foreign. This is not him all of a sudden going, yes, I am now going to bring Christian nationalism to Alabama. This was already there. I know this was already there. The recognition that human life is from God.
Well, and the fact is that even though they don't want, like, there was recently that clip that went viral that I made a reel about how like we don't get our rights from anyone on this earth, but from God. And how that's supposed to be. Yeah. That now is supposed
I shared that one too, because that was like, wow, how are you even on television?
Well, I mean, like literally not only in our Declaration of Independence, but it's in our Constitution.
Poor girl. She really thought she was bringing it too. She's like, this is going to be such a fire interview that I'm going.
Well, she's a contributor to Politico, and this whole thing happened on MSNBC. So I don't think we can really be surprised.
No, not at all. But it's embarrassing.
Yeah, it is. It was funny. I mean, it was bad.
It was comical. It was like a Babylon Bee article, video.
But all of that to say that when everyone's freaking out and they're saying they use the Bible to come to this ruling, no.
Welcome to America. Go look at our founding documents. He was already there. Okay.
Like what he's doing is defining sanctity of life, which is what is in the Alabama Constitution. And so it brings in that whole discussion. And then he goes through a really tedious explanation. I mean, I couldn't get over is like the dictionary explanations. So the next time, if you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, they quoted the Bible in it. Well, now you know exactly why. And it wasn't the original opinion. It was just a concurring opinion to kind of give a little bit more explanation as to the state of mind of the people of Alabama and what they elected to have amended into their constitution.
I mean, it's so comprehensive. It's very comprehensive. It's not like he literally just said, here's some Bible verses and that's why I did it. He pulled from all kinds of different texts and different case law. And that's important,
and another thing that he brought up, what I thought was interesting, and if you have it pulled up, Rachel, it's on page 42.
Yeah.
He addresses Alexander Hamilton and what he wrote in the Federalist number 78. And so here he kind of touches on how his logic in regards to, because other justices have talked about the conflict of legislation with the Constitution. And then he addresses that question here and he quotes because Alexander Hamilton wrote this in the Federalist. It says, where the will of the legislator declared in its statutes stands in opposition to that of the people declared in the Constitution, the judges ought to be governed by the latter rather than the former. So essentially what they're saying is like, if there's legislation that said X, but then they pass a constitutional amendment that says Y and it conflicts, it is the judge's duty to go with the constitutional amendment.
Yeah, because of the Alabama Constitution, the amendment protecting the unborn.
So
that's
if
what
anyone's
the justice
arguing
was compelled to do.
That it's in conflict or whatever, this is kind of, or that our founding fathers did not expect this or believe this, or that's not the original thought. Well, here you have Alexander Hamilton writing it in the Federalist, which kind of gives you like,
yes, they did.
Yeah. Then their state of mind.
They're a lot smarter than they're given credit for these days.
I wanted to add that in because I thought that would be an interesting thing to know about. So that is the whole drama about like they quoted the Bible.
Yeah, and it just feeds right into the whole, like we talked about. I know we're going over time. It's just so important, like all this stuff. But this goes into, it touches on how this Christian nationalist rhetoric is going to pick up steam, like I mentioned at the top of the show. So just be leery of that. That is going to be, it will be used in propaganda. It is going to be put at the forefront of the discussion. It will be for the Democrat platform, abortion. Christians are trying to take over your country. They want you to have all the children, regardless of climate change, and they want to strip you from birth control.
It's going to take away women's rights. They're not going to be able to work.
Yes, of course. Even though, ironically, AOC said the quiet part out loud when she was like, Christians, this is a male-dominated theocracy, a patriarchal theocracy, and they're coming for our abortion, or they're coming for our abortions, our reproductive care. They're coming for our birth control. Can you believe the mifepristone case is going to be ruled by the Supreme Court this term? And I thought, yeah, you just said what we all say all the time is that you use abortion for birth control. You're using mifepristone as an example of birth control. That's not birth control. That's a medical abortion. But that is what is important to them. This is their sacred cow. This is their platform. And they're going to take it. And now that they have their teeth in this Christian nationalist narrative, they're going to marry the two together.
Language that is starting, which has been bubbling under the surface for a while. And now is just kind of like, as we get closer to the election, and especially if Trump wins, it's going to continue to escalate. Initially, the idea of Christian nationalists was like, I hate to make this compare, but like Sharia law, but for Christians. Do you know what I mean? So where all of our laws would be governed by the Bible, as opposed to, currently, I mean, since our founding fathers established this country, even the atheists, even those who did not believe, they acknowledged that there was a creator and that that was the source of our documents, because that's what gives us our rights.
Right. And it also is the underpinning for the moral decisions that we make when we enact laws. If that is porous and there's no moral foundation, well, then what is the morality we're going to use by which to legislate? And
if we're being
what morality we're using then?
Human beings like ourselves, then it's going to change like every other Tuesday. You know what I mean? So, but now, like we saw on MSNBC, and it's probably going to continue from there, is that anything, if you happen to support legislation that happens to align with your religious beliefs, which should, I mean, that's just a fact. That's how it should work.
Right. You're right.
That in of itself is Christian nationalism. Or the fact that you even believe that our inalienable rights come from our creator, which is literally what's in the Constitution. You are a Christian nationalist. You know what I mean?
I've heard that somewhere.
Exactly.
Basically, if you're a Christian right now, you are a Christian nationalist.
It was never clearly defined when that language first started. And now it's so broadly defined, which is something that progressives in the left constantly do. They love to play with definitions. Now it applies to anyone who happens to be a Christian. Mind you, it never applies to anyone else. Maybe Jewish, like the Jewish people now with everything that's going on with Israel and everything. But for the most part, or anyone who's white adjacent is like how they like to put it. But for the most part, if any other religion, it doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? It's specifically right now here in the United States, it's the issue of Christians. So is there anything else that we should touch on real quick?
I would say probably, I think a lot of people are going to want us to have a clear statement on IVF as a whole. And I think we've made our opinions pretty clear throughout the whole episode. But I think, I don't think it would hurt to compassionately share what our views on the industry as a whole are. And, it's pretty simple. For me, I believe that IVF has not been reckoned with by Christians and by conservatives writ large. And I think that is because it's uncomfortable, because we all know people who have used IVF or considered IVF. We know children that are wonderful creations of the Lord that we love, and they were products of IVF. And I think that it's really hard to say out loud, that we believe it's an industry that should not exist when those present realities exist. But it's the same, I feel, in essence, as the conversation surrounding abortion. Not that IVF and abortion are necessarily congruent, but they're adjacent in that we all know someone who's had an abortion, who suffered from that, who chose that. And we can, at the same time we say we believe abortion is wrong and should not be legal, yet we still love you, despite the choice you made. And I think IVF is difficult because there are people actively using it who want children, who are well-intentioned people, some of them, but the misuse of this industry, the medical malpractice that is currently playing out with, like we said, millions of frozen babies just sitting on ice all over our country, all over the world. It's a tragedy if we are consistent in our thinking about life. And if we're willing to say that we believe that life begins at conception, as conservatives, as Christians, as pro-lifers, wherever you may be there, then we have to be able to say that IVF presents a unique and really troubling issue for us, because then we'd have to reckon with the millions of people who access it, who use it as kind of a fallback if a pregnancy doesn't work. Well, don't worry, I have more in storage. For people who take out an indiscriminate amount of, embryos and then they freeze them indefinitely. The people who, I read an article in the Post this week about people who, people don't want to reckon with them, with those frozen embryos that are just left for years and forgotten, no longer paid for the actual preservation of them, and they're destroyed. We would also need to talk about then the selective abortions that go into
the reduction,
the procedure of IVF that are almost inevitable. Yeah, the reductions, I will call it that. In many, many cases, a vast majority of them. So as an ethical and moral issue, I believe that IVF is wrong, and I would like to see it no longer available. But that doesn't mitigate the fact that there are people who are currently using it. And it's hard to have that conversation, but I think it's one that Christians have been loath to have and have not.
And I'll say for myself, I do not have children. And I don't have children because I can't have children, not because I don't want to. And the option of IVF was presented to me. And if you were really to sit down and have a full discussion with your partner about what that entails, you kind of come to the conclusion, unless, I could say for myself, we came to the conclusion of what it really meant. And it was just something that we were not willing to do. And so here I am still, we've tried adoption through the state. Every time we have moved, we've had to restart the process. And so now here I am at like 45 years old without children. It is what it is. And I've gotten to the point where it's like, what am I, you know what I mean? What am I going to do? It's fine. Yeah. Like I have come to terms and I have peace about that. And I only share that story because I understand when, it's easy for people to say like, well, you don't know what it's like, or we don't, when, and I was like, I do. I've been through that whole mourning stage and that realization, and I've come out the other end. I'm like 10 years away from it though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I think, in regards to when we're talking about conservatives and Christians, we put a lot, rightfully so, we put a lot of emphasis on having children. And I think I think children are a blessing. I think it's necessary. People think that I don't like kids because I don't have kids, but I actually really like them. You know what I mean?
And that's a whole other burden you're having to carry.
Yeah. You know what I mean? So I personally do not believe that parenthood is a right.
It's not.
Yeah. I don't think that anybody has a right to do anything possible in order to be a parent. And so I didn't believe that it was like my right to satisfy my desire to have children at
no matter the cost.
No matter the cost, at the detriment of what I believe to be a life. And the fact of the matter is that currently when you undergo IVF, most clinics, most doctors will not allow you to do, like, unless it's like you aren't able to produce X number of healthy embryos, they won't let you do like a one-time deal. You know what I mean?
Right.
They want you to do multiple because they want to increase their chances, because of course it is important for this doctor to be successful in helping you have a child, because it also helps their practice. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so not having multiples affects their numbers and affects their practice. And frankly, my assumption would be like the more embryos you can produce, the more money it's going to produce also.
Right. Well, and they can, because the more you produce, it's an initial reaction of, I would say most mothers to go, I don't want to just discard them. Like, let's save them. And now you're on the hook for storage fees for the cryo nursery.
Well, and then a lot of people will be like, well, now you just adopt out these embryos. Well, let me tell you, the adoption process is not as easy as people want to make it out to be, regardless of which way you go, whether it's through the state or it's private. And then especially if you're like my husband and I, and you make a good living and you're well off, a lot of these private adoptions are based on your income, and we come in with the highest bill, which is irritating because even like that's a whole other issue. I'm sharing that just to say, like, I know where you're coming from if you're going through that. There is, in my belief, a definitive moral and ethical line. This is a life. This is a child. And this is not treating your infertility. And that's a lot of things that people don't understand. This is not treating your infertility. This is creating a life. Because if it was treating your infertility, at some point you would be able to have the child naturally. You wouldn't need the IVF. It's like this whole thing, especially with women's health or just like medicalization in general, they don't treat the cause.
The whole human.
They treat the symptom. And IVF is doing the same thing. Because if it was treating your infertility, you would be able to have a child without the need of freezing an embryo. And then after that, you would be able to have multiple children. And then the other thing is that we should no longer, I think as a society as a whole, be depending on IVF for us to sow our wild oats or pursue our career and think that we have all the time of the world and the likelihood of maybe having a child that's been like defrosted. And do you understand what I'm saying? Which that in itself causes stress to the embryo and limits the viability of that embryo. When you go and you freeze and you defrost and you implant and you transfer, that affects the viability also. And that was another thing. Like, if I'm going to be completely honest, not only did I have like a moral and ethical issue with it, I just thought it was insane to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on the possibility that I already thought was ethically and morally questionable. But I will say that I think a lot of women do not, especially when it comes to abortion or IVF, at the time that they engage with it, they are not informed and they do not fully understand what it really is. They've been told that it's a clump of cells and that it doesn't matter when it comes to abortion. And when it comes to IVF, just think about the beautiful child you're going to have at the end of it. Or
it's such twisted thinking. It is so
exactly. It's manipulating the truth.
And it's very, that's right. And it's very convenient thinking too, because the same people that will talk about how IVF needs to be preserved to give women options and so that they can have these children that they've dreamed about. The same people that will say that and make everybody very afraid right now that IVF is going to be off the table. They're the same people who are publishing pieces like the one I read today in the Washington Post, I believe, where they said, look at what Alabama's doing. They're now basically saying that a blob in a petri dish is the same as your child, and using language like that. So in the same breath that they're asking women to trust this procedure to be able to have their dreams come true, they're also telling them, but don't believe it that much because it's a blob in a petri dish. And so it's convenient.
It's convenient language. It's
illogical. Not consistent thinking that has gotten us to where we are here.
And so I think that's all I have to. I will say one more thing just before we go off. Specifically because when they were talking, they'll argue like so you can have your career, have your cake and eat it too, essentially. Or there's also a lot of debate or a lot of concern about the increased infertility, which is an issue. I'm not going to deny that there is an infertility issue. I think a lot of the infertility is a symptom, not so like in regards to our diet, the hormones that they're pumping into young women starting at the age of 16 with birth control. Also, the testosterone level issues with young men. However, your fertility when you're younger, regardless of the issue that we are having fertility issues. When you are younger, it is better than when you are older.
Yes, right.
Because unfortunately, even though right now we're in some weird timeline where we're trying to manipulate biology and say that a woman isn't a woman
and live forever.
Yeah, like everything's kind of getting weird. Their objective truth, science, biology is an objective truth. And women, like we get older, you start to lose your eggs. Or actually, you're losing your eggs from the moment that you start your cycle. So like, you are minimizing your chance or you're increasing your infertility issues. And I just did an air quote there for infertility issues. The older you get. And the reason I'm using an air quote is because, you might have infertility issues, but also fertility becomes an issue the older you get.
Yeah. Right. Yes, there is. Yes, I totally agree. And I think that this could be a whole other conversation when it comes to the issue of birth control in our country and how women are treated. Oh, we could talk forever.
Yeah. So, but I think hopefully we touched on all of the major points about this opinion. Essentially, I hope you got something out of it. I think we gave you enough to where like you're informed, but being weary of like if anybody's trying to cause panic or freak you out, it's not as the media and especially the left will try and scare you into. And frankly, I'm seeing a lot of that within conservative circles that admirably want to have children. And I like,
they're just freaking out for a different reason.
Yes. And I totally get that. So if you found this conversation beneficial, I would encourage you to share it with a friend, give it a 5-star review wherever you're listening it to. Main platform is it's on itsmeseidy.com as a podcast. And then where can they find you, Rachel?
I am on Instagram at Here Are the Headlines, where I share daily news and political commentary and talk about parenthood. And, I try and marry parenthood with government policy and also some history mixed in there. So I'm on Instagram. That's where I'm at.
Excellent. And I will include the link to her Instagram. And she also has a Substack where she writes some really great historical pieces, which as a history nerd, I greatly appreciate. And then if you guys have any questions specifically on this, if you want us to expand on this topic, or if you have an idea for something else, please feel free to shoot me an email. There'll be a link in the notes, or send either one of us a DM. So I think that's about it. Thank you so much, Rachel, for...
Yeah, this was a great idea. It was a good idea we had. I had a good time. I mean, just like talking about issues of absolutely no consequence.
Yeah.
Just easy breezy. Honestly, easy breezy.
This type of stuff, sometimes I'm just like, I need to police myself because I can't pull a Joe Rogan because it wouldn't be like wise, but I could talk about this probably half the day and not get anything else done.
Same. You just saved my husband from listening to me talk about it for an hour tonight.
I know.
Thank you.
Same. Yeah. So I'm going to include all the links to our socials, to our Substacks. And also, if you want to read the opinion for yourself, I will include a link to the opinion and the acts that are referenced in the opinion. So that way you don't have to go. If you're a nerd like us that likes to read governmental documents and court opinions, they'll be
a good time.
I know, right? Just wild and crazy times. They'll be in the show notes. So thanks so much, you guys, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.